This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. What would college and job training programs look like if the people who designed them asked teenagers about their hopes and dreams and really listened to the answers? That's the provocative premise of a new project by today's guest, Rebecca Koenig. She's the higher education editor for EdSurge. She profiled 9 teens from across the country, all in very different communities and educational settings, who are thinking about their futures. She also spoke to 24 educators, economists, psychologists, employers, and other experts to figure out the intersection between adolescent brain development and the best educational programs that can actually tap into a young person's curiosity, passion, and enthusiasm for learning. Rebecca, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
This was a massive undertaking. What was the impetus for it?
So I was lucky enough to receive a fellowship through the Institute for Citizens and Scholars to cover something about career and technical post-secondary education. It was very open-ended other than that. And so I thought I would go big. I thought I would sort of try some new reporting and journalism activities that I hadn't really tackled before. And I landed on photojournalism, a little bit of audio recording. But most of all, I was intrigued to kind of get into career and technical questions from a sort of different angle rather than starting with folks who had settled on that as their path. I kind of wanted to back up a step and think, how do people end up pursuing that or pursuing college? And it just kind of led me to this question of how are people deciding what to do after high school?
Well, we know that this is a huge transition period for young people, both in terms of just that chronological clock, right? I mean, you're departing high school. Most of the time, you're maybe leaving your parents' house and heading out into the quote-unquote real world. But it's also a major time of change in terms of their brain development. Help us to understand, what does the neuroscience tell us about adolescence as a developmental period?
Something that people might not realize is adolescence really encompasses more years than you might think. It starts at puberty, maybe middle school, high school, depending on the individual, and goes all the way into the mid-20s. So it's really not just your teenage years. And that is important because it means that people sometimes having to make choices while they're still really in the thick of this brain development. And psychology shows us that adolescents are thinking about new activities and passions. They're sort of questioning and redefining their identities. They're exploring, they're taking risks. They are really tuned into their peer relationships. Their friends become so important to them. And they're striking it out on their own, or at least, taking steps to experiment with that.
This seems like a particularly vulnerable period to be making such big decisions that ultimately shape, for better or for worse, their long-term career paths.
Yes, it really is a vulnerable period. And something that sources told me over and over is that for young people who go to college, they sort of get 4+ years to extend their adolescence, so to speak. They get this extra time to experiment, to take risks, to think about who they want to be. Whereas people who graduate from high school and enter the workforce right away are kind of pushed into so-called adulthood before their brains necessarily are ready for it. And this has consequences that last for the rest of people's lives. So it's sort of a big thing to put on the shoulders of a 17 or 18-year-old.
I want to talk about some of the experts you spoke with. There's a lot of data in the story and a lot of important data points, especially given this perennial debate that we hear around the question of, is college worth it? And people who've been on the education beat for a long time will see this sort of swing back and forth. Every decade or so, it will rise back up. As recently as just a couple years ago, people saying, we need welders, not philosophers, I think was one of the headlines that I'd seen in one of the papers. But you talked with Anthony Carnevale, and he is the director of Georgetown University's Center on Education and the Workforce. And I want to read this quote from your story in which you said that 20% of people who have just a high school diploma get what Carnevale calls a good job. That's one that pays at least $35,000 for workers younger than age 45, and at least $45,000 for workers ages 45 to 64. It seems clear from this research that for a lot of people, it's still going to be worth it, at least from a financial standpoint, to have some post-secondary education.
That's right. And research out of Carnevale's great center, which I highly recommend everybody check out. There are really interesting reports, shows that in the past several decades, it used to be that you really could graduate from high school, go get a job in manufacturing, and make a decent living. And manufacturing jobs really have been lost since then, largely sort of replaced by growth in the skilled services sector, which a lot of this is sort of desk work. And a lot of that requires a degree or at least some kind of credential. So the loss of these jobs that don't require any sort of post high school training and the growth of jobs that do require it means that it's typically worth it for somebody to get more training. Now, that doesn't mean everybody can easily afford a 4-year bachelor's degree, but it means that high schools are doing folks a disservice if not pointing 11th and 12th graders to some sort of credential after high school.
While the debate may be unsettled for some people on whether college is a worthwhile investment, you did find plenty of research that many, many young people and their families believe it's the path to a better future. Where was there some consistency in those numbers?
It was pretty interesting. I looked at a number of different polls and surveys of young people and their parents and found that, at least according to one that I cited, this Washington Post poll from 2021, 82% of the more than 1,000 teenagers who responded consider graduating from college important. And this was the case for the overwhelming majority of Black teens, Asian teens, Hispanic teens, and slightly smaller, but still the majority of white teens. So that's, kind of across racial lines, these young people think it's important. A different poll from Gallup of parents found that there's a bit more discrepancy depending on race. More parents of Black children said that they preferred that their child pursue a bachelor's degree. And that was higher than parents of white children and higher than parents of Hispanic children. So, sort of interesting to note that parents of Black children are really valuing college, maybe even higher than their counterparts. We also found that in that Gallup poll, parents who have a college degree are more likely to want that for their kids. Parents in suburbs are more likely to want that for their kids. And parents who identify as Democrats are more likely to want college for their kids.
I know Gallup can't ask every question, but I wish they could ask a follow-up, which is, and if we asked you this question with a guarantee that your child would not incur debt, how far would you allow them to go in school?
Yeah, that would be super interesting.
Well, I'll call Gallup and see what I can get done, Rebecca, and then we'll come back and talk about it. There was another quote from Carnevale, and I thought this one was a little provocative, so I want you to unpack it for me. He said, "The economy and the education system are in cahoots." What did he mean?
It's a great line. As soon as he said it, I said, oh, we got to use that one. So, what he means by that is based on all the data we have, these decisions young people are making about education really have consequences for their financial well-being. In some cases, for the rest of their lives. It's not to say you have to go to college right out of high school, but whether or not you're getting that credential or a degree affects how much money you can make in the labor market. There are also correlations between higher ed and things like health outcomes. So I think it's important that people understand that this is a very personal decision. And I think you'll kind of get that from the story, but it does have these serious consequences for people. And this is not something that a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old is necessarily processing, partly because, as we talked before, their biology and their psychology are not necessarily prioritizing these sort of very serious decisions. They're busy doing other things, which is really important to them growing and learning. But it means it's really important for the adults in their lives to kind of help walk them through these consequences.
I want to turn to the students in your story because they really are the heart of it. And there's a hugely diverse range of voices, suburban, urban, rural, and they have very different expectations and goals for their own futures. How did you set about finding them?
I knew that I really wanted to sort of cross the country and find people from all these different settings. And so one way I did that is going back through my source list and finding people from interesting spots in the country who have ever pitched me anything and saying to them, hey, I'm really interested in finding students from your school district or from your region. I'd love it if you could put me in touch with the school system, with a teacher. Do you work with any students? And people were really helpful. They sort of kind of got what I was after. I also, in some places, sort of went right to the school district or right to a particular school leader who maybe I'd been in touch with before. I looked up workforce training programs and nonprofits because community-based programs are really in tune with the individuals who are either participating, doing after school programs, doing sort of high school internships. I went to some of those educators and said, hey, can you help me find someone who you think would be willing to share their story with me? And I found that that was more effective than just sort of broadcasting a call out on social media. And after doing the reporting, realizing that one reason that is that young people really trust the adults in their lives rather than me, a stranger, kind of posting on Twitter. So I recommend going that route.
Is there one of these students who really sticks with you when you think about this project or story that you want to talk about first?
Yes. Although I learned so much from all of them, I will say I feel like I especially learned from two students. One of them is Spencer, who comes from a farming family in Idaho. He was very patient in explaining farming to me. As someone who has never farmed, I had a lot of questions. And one thing I was curious about was why he was very intent on going to college. I kind of was thinking, well, you already farm, you've got the hookup with farming. Why do you need to go to college? And he explained that really what he does is labor, but there's a ton of business and science that goes into running a successful farm. And he figured that it would be quicker and better to get that training in college as opposed to just picking it up slowly over years and years as a laborer. And that made a lot of sense to me. And the other student who I really can't get out of my mind is Vernell. And he is from New Orleans. He is so driven, very clever. He runs his own businesses in addition to going to school. And he decided that college is not a good investment. And he's someone who thinks a lot about personal finance. And so for him, he looked around him and realized people in his family hadn't really succeeded in college. And so he thought, based on this data that he had at his fingertips, it didn't really make sense. And so he found a job right after school and was very excited about it. And I thought it was a really good perspective that from his point of view, in his ecosystem, college didn't really seem worth it.
We're talking with Rebecca Koenig of EdSurge about her reporting on young people, their hopes and dreams, and what that information might mean to how we think about college preparation programs and job training. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who's told your friends how much you like the podcast and encouraged them to subscribe as well. Rebecca, you visited some community-based programs that try and surround students with support services while exposing them to high-quality career training. What did you find that these more successful programs have in common?
One thing that I heard, and which seemed to play out, is that services really need to be built around the input and the needs of the young people that they're trying to serve, rather than basing their program design on economic data alone. They really have to incorporate the daily realities of young people who sometimes have trouble with transportation. They can't always afford to pay tuition up front. They have to do schoolwork. They may have sort of side jobs to pay the bills. And so adults designing these programs find that they have more success when young people are sort of at the heart of the design of the program.
You also wrote that, quote, rather than lowering the ceiling of how high teenagers dream, some educators are raising the floor so that adolescents do what they do best, learning, growing, and taking risks, don't have so far to fall. Can you give us a specific example of that you encountered in your reporting?
Yes, the folks in Baltimore City Public Schools are taking this really seriously. And if you look at data out of Baltimore, you'll see that the college graduation rate is not very high for many reasons, a lot of having to do with sort of barriers to college that students there encounter. So a few years ago, the school system took another look at its college and career readiness programming and decided to really emphasize pathways to jobs that exceed a living wage. So, sort of emphasizing work that pays well enough for people to live on. And after figuring out what those jobs were in Baltimore, they redesigned their curriculum so that training that leads to work that pays under a living wage is de emphasized. Often there, it's sort of culinary and cosmetology, realizing that training students for those jobs might not really serve them in the long term. So they decreased the number of seats in those courses. And then they increased the number of seats in courses that are more promising in terms of labor market payoffs. And I think that the shift has really started working there and students have responded to it. And I think that that would be a model for other areas to kind of consider if they're trying to do this themselves.
We talked about pendulum swinging back and forth, and there's another important one that you cover in your story that I want to make sure that we talk about here. And that is this idea of college for all as being a mindset. And I mean, I can remember where it seemed like overnight, suddenly every elementary school was renaming its hallways after the Ivy Leagues, and every
Mhm.
classroom was hung with college banners. What has changed now in how public schools approach preparing students for life after high school? Where is the pendulum hanging?
The ecosystems that I focused on were these places where graduation rates from college aren't especially high, like Baltimore and New Orleans, some rural places. And what I heard there was this focus more on job skills and career preparation. But I do want to mention that talking about career doesn't necessarily exclude going to college. The language in Baltimore is something like everybody needs a career, and there are many ways to get there, which is to say, they're not just promoting college as the end goal for no other reason other than just it's good to go to college. They're sort of emphasizing college can help you get to where you want to go. And so I think that's sort of the shift I'm seeing now. It's not so much college being totally de-emphasized. It's just highlighting for students that life doesn't stop after you get that college degree. College is a way to get to this good life that we know all young people are focusing on.
You mentioned that you took this fellowship opportunity from the Institute for Citizens and Scholars as a way to help sort of broaden your experience as a journalist and try some new things. And I'm wondering, did you learn any new approaches that were particularly helpful during this project, especially around talking with young people?
Yes. Something I tried in this project, which I don't typically do, was kind of offering to do a background chat with students before sort of putting them on the record for the story. And I had a little extra time compared to, sort of a daily or weekly story. So I figured I would go ahead and do this. And on one hand, for my purposes, it kind of served as a screening call to make sure people would be a good fit for the story. But also, I discovered it really, I think, gave them a chance to get comfortable. It gave them a chance to really consent or not consent to being in the story, which seems important, especially again, we're talking with young people. It seemed important to get their trust, to let them really be heard. And so then I came back to them, the ones who wanted to participate and seemed like a good fit, and said, okay, so the second call, I'm hoping to be on the record, really taking the time to explain what that means to them. That was an approach that I think I would definitely use going forward in talking to teenagers.
As an education reporter, I've asked countless students some variation on the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? Or what kind of work do you want to do? But I'm hard pressed to think of a moment where I specifically asked them about their hopes or dreams. And honestly, that feels like a lot of missed opportunities right now.
hmm Knowing what I know now about how excited young people are about their passions, I feel like it's a question I plan to build in going forward just because it really lights them up. They love to talk about what is exciting them. And I think that's a good way to build rapport as well. In addition to just hearing what they have to say, Vernell was so excited about his long term dreams to be a business owner. And I don't think I would necessarily have gotten that if I just said, "What do you plan to do next year?" He's not thinking about next year. He's thinking about the end of his career when he's going to be a really successful business owner in his community. And I got to that just sort of by asking him, "What are you hoping for?" So I recommend it. Build that question into your reporting process.
You were reporting during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you feel like some of the answers you were getting from students about hopes and fears were probably influenced by that?
Yes, something I wondered about going into it was, are these going to be really sort of universal answers? Are these going to be very pandemic era answers? And I think those things are not very separable because it's just the reality now. But I definitely heard from students sort of a lot of stress. They found the pandemic really stressful to alternate between learning at home, learning at school, being able to see their friends, not being able to see their friends, feeling very distant from the educators who they rely on to give them good advice. So I definitely perceived this heaviness that you might not necessarily expect if we hadn't been living through this pandemic.
For reporters who want to follow your lead on this topic, where should they be looking for research and good perspective sources?
The data from the Georgetown University Center on Education in the Workforce is a really great place to start. They've pulled together so much information about the economic consequences of people's education choices. I would also point people to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. There's a lot of great information there about occupations, what credentials they require, sort of the fastest growing jobs, who's taking them, that sort of thing. So for data, I would point to those places. In terms of sort of educators and students, really go to these community-based organizations. It can take a few extra phone calls or emails because, they're doing very direct service work. They're not necessarily waiting for reporters to call. But finding the folks in your communities who work directly with students is a great way to find young people who are excited to share their stories.
Do you have a couple of story ideas you could share with reporters who may be writing about these kinds of things, job training programs, post-secondary pathways, or even just adolescents more broadly?
Yes, something I did not get too deep into in this piece, but I'm excited to follow up on are apprenticeship programs, which have always been around, but I think the federal government is paying more attention and investing more in them. Community colleges are partnering with them. They're being sort of built more into the higher ed ecosystem. You can now get college credit for completing them. So that's one area I would look toward. I would also say I noticed, I didn't necessarily call it out, but so many of the students in my story do participate in dual enrollment while they're in high school. They're also taking community college classes. And that really seems to set, at least the folks I talk to, set them up for success. So I think that is something to pay attention to is in your region or nationally, what's the status of dual enrollment? And is that working well in terms of getting students set up to succeed after high school?
I think those are great suggestions. And on the dual enrollment front, a great question is, how are students finding out about that program? Where are they recruiting them from? How
Mhm.
equitable are those opportunities? And what is provided to make sure the students have transportation to get to and from those classes, the times that they're offered, and just how fairly that's being distributed? Because it's a fantastic opportunity. Rebecca Koenig is an editor at EdSurge covering higher education. She is also a higher education media fellow at the Institute for Citizens and Scholars. Rebecca, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you so much.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, just drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.